Alright, so good morning everyone and welcome to the Linguistics Special Lecture Series, or LSLS, organized by the UP Department of Linguistics. LSLS features talks by invited speakers on various topics in the fields of theoretical and applied linguistics. This year, the installments of the Linguistics Special Lecture Series are conducted in celebration of the centennial anniversary of the UP Department of Linguistics. And the UP Department of Linguistics is an academic institution under the College of Social Sciences and Philosophy, which is distinctly focused on the scientific study, preservation, and promotion of Philippine languages and dialects through research, teaching, archiving, and publication. It is also mandated to use its research expertise to address language issues in the country. Aside from Philippine linguistics, the department is also recognized as an expert in teaching the national languages of Asia. It is designated as a center of excellence in foreign languages by the Philippines Commission on Higher Education. Today, we are fortunate to have with us Jérôme to share with us the results of his research, specifically on language policies in Indonesia. I am sure that our linguistics students who are currently enrolled in Linguistics 180 and my students in Linguistics 166 are excited to know more about this topic and perhaps compare the experience of the Philippines and Indonesia. Okay, so to introduce our speaker this morning, Jérôme is a full professor at INALCO, or the National Institute for Oriental Languages and Civilizations, focusing on Indonesian and Malaysian studies. He is currently the director of IRASEC, or a research institute on contemporary Southeast Asia, and an associate researcher at CASE. He's also the chief editor of the journal Article, Interdisciplinary Studies on the Indonesian World. And his work focuses mainly on Malay terminologies, language policies, didactics, interdialectal mutual intelligibility, and in a completely different field on reverse glass painting in Indonesia. To deliver a lecture titled Language Attrition and Language Display, Regional Language Policies in Indonesia Today, let us all welcome Jérôme.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. Good morning, dear colleagues and dear students. I'm very happy to be here to get the opportunity to give a talk today. It's my very first visit to the Philippines, the very first time I come here. And I hope in the future I get other opportunities, other occasion to come here again. So I think I have nothing to add to what you explained. Just one or two things. My first researches on Indonesia and on Indonesian were focused on the language and on the language policy, more specifically on terminological policy. I was interested during my PhD in trying to understand and to explain how the Indonesian planners, Indonesian engineers, language engineers try to modernize the language, and how far this endeavor was linked to previous policies during the colonial era, what they did during the 50s, the 60s, until the end of the 20th century. And then after that, I was, or at the same time, I was interested in regional languages, but not, it was a secondary interest. I teach Indonesian. I wrote a textbook in Indonesian. I would say that Indonesian is my second language, but I don't really know regional languages. I have some knowledge of Javanese and Balinese, but that's all. It's not that much. And it's very limited, actually. And I'm fully aware that if you want to understand what's happening with regional languages in Indonesia or elsewhere, you need to master, to use and to master at least one regional, it's really a challenge for foreigners. It's easy. You can learn the national language. You can learn the substandards too. But to learn and to use a regional language, it requires you to stay a very long time on the field, and to interact daily with people whose regional language is the mother tongue, which was It could have been the case for me, but it wasn't, unfortunately. Anyway, and more recently, I have been more interested in the teaching of Indonesian and didactics of Indonesian, and even more recently, again, interested in the links and the mutual intelligibility between Indonesian and Malaysian. Both languages are standards, national standards, but closely related. And actually, until now, we don't know how far it is, we know how far it is related, but how far Indonesian people do understand Malaysian-speaking people, and conversely, for the other, from Malaysian to Indonesian. It hasn't really been studied. Anyway, this will not be the topic of my talk today. I will speak about the regional languages and mainly the language policies related with regional languages. So I began with the background and what was the policy in the late 20th century. Then I shift to the slightly different policies since 20 years ago, and I end with the questions related to the current situation and the fate of these possible fate of these regional languages. But to begin, I would like to play a short movie. It's an advertisement, you'll see, and so it's just 1 minute. So there is no sound. Maybe it's not correctly connected. Or maybe I should...
Can you try it again?
Hmm?
Can you try it again?
Yeah, okay. No. Oh, okay. Okay, well, I guess that you know what's Indomie. Maybe you've tasted it already. Alors, attends, je vais essayer de mettre là-dessus. So, this is an advertisement for Indomie. And Indomie is well known in the whole Indonesia, everywhere. It's very cheap, as you know. Maybe it's cheap here in the Philippines, and it's something very common, and it's shared by other people. I mean, the food itself, Indomie, especially that food, which is produced in Indonesia. The name is Indomie, so me mixed with the name of the country. And in a way, it gives a sense of the Indonesian motto, which is unity in diversity. By the way, maybe we should keep in mind that this motto, unity in diversity, this is the English translation. In Indonesian, it's Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, which is not Indonesian. It's not Indonesian. This is an old Japanese. It's written in Old Japanese, and it comes from a text from the Old Japanese literature written in the mid-10th or 11th century. So, well, it says that everyone enjoy the Indomie, and we're happy to to live together and to share and to eat together in the Midwest. It's a great idea, but a little bit limited in a way. But anyway, what's interesting here is the display of the regional languages. So that's what is interesting to me. And if we see, this is the map of Indonesia with the languages, regional languages. I know that that kind of map is not really reliable because we know that, for instance, in this area, of course, other languages are spoken to, and the map doesn't say anything to us regarding the amount of population who speaks each language and about the very mixed and multilingual situation too. So, but still it's interesting and it can be useful too. The first language which appears in the advertisement is not Indonesian, it's not an Indonesian language, it's English. And this has to be underlined. And then we have 8 languages, or 1 plus 7 languages which are mentioned here, the last one being Indonesian, of course. But all these languages don't have the same position, the same status, actually. And we can see that most of the languages are even not quoted here, of course. But the number 2 is Malay. It's a Malay dialect. So it's very closely related with Indonesian, although for my part, I've never been to Manado here, but I'm sure that if I go to Manado, I can read in Manadonese dialect. I would understand it, not 90%, but I would understand it. But if I hear people speaking Manadonese Malay, I'm sure I won't understand a single word, or very few. So it's closely related, but when you think about oral use of the language, it begins to be much more difficult. Number 3 is Papua Malay, another Malay dialect, spoken in the region whereby the Malay was introduced quite recently. Number 3 is, no, the Papua Malay. Number 4 is Batak. Batak is not a language, actually. It's just, yes, it's a cluster of very related, closely related languages and dialects. It's commonly used, it's very useful, but actually it doesn't point towards one specific language, so another bias. Number 5, Palembang. Palembang is not really a Malay, but it's so close to Malay. So once again, we meet Malay. This is interesting because Malay actually doesn't appear in the official discourse on regional languages, not that much. Other regional languages are much more important. The dialects, and specifically Malay dialects, have been recognized as something which has to be preserved or developed very recently in Indonesia. In Malaysia, it's completely different. Malay dialects are much more important for Malaysian compared to Indonesian. Maybe because very few Indonesians have any Malay dialect as a mother tongue, very few. Number 6 is Balinese, which is the most iconic island and region of Indonesia for the world outside, for the outsiders. And this region is different from the others, not only because the majority of the population is Hinduist, but most important is this is the only one island with one culture, let's say 90% of the population living here, one culture, one religion, which has been created as a single province. The only one. Java is divided in four provinces now, and all other provinces are multilingual, which was not the case in Bali until, let's say, the late 20th century. Now many things have changed, but it's not very easy to speak about it for the people. Number 7, so almost the last one, is Javanese, which is quite hypercritical because actually Javanese is the first regional language in Indonesia. More than 40% of the population has Javanese as a mother tongue. But they put it in the last position purposely, I'm sure, just to say that we don't want to put the Japanese on the front, because many people were and still are complaining about the weight of the Japanese population and the Japanese language in Indonesia. This was true until the very end of the 20th century. Now many things have changed, and the weight of Japanese is not so important as it was until the end of the Suharto era. So now so here the question I would like to address and to ask during this presentation. First, the current situation of the languages, and in itself, and related to the national language, Indonesian, and maybe in relation with substandards. Substandards are very important everywhere in the world, but in Indonesia it is, and I would like to underline that fact. So, what are the trends today? This is the second set of questions. The force who are driving the Indonesian language, the substandards, and the regional languages, the attitude of the speakers toward the languages, the attitude of the politicians, and the administration towards the regional languages, and lastly, what could be the fate of it? How could it turn? We are facing attrition of regional languages. This is evident, but to what extent? And how will be their situation in the next 10, 20, or 50 years? Are we going toward the kind of heritagisation which happened in Europe? Will these languages considered finally as just heritage language? Like a heritage we have to preserve, not to use it anymore, but to preserve it. So this is a big question. So I begin with the backgrounds, and then I speak about the changes after the Suharto era, which were interesting and continuation of what have been made before, but very important changes too. And related to these changes, the legislative apparatus, regulatory apparatus, which has been created and enforced mainly locally, related to the local languages, the attrition of it, and lastly, ask about the possible heritagisation of these languages. So I begin with the background first. We have a very multilingual country, as are the Philippines. Actually, it's not very different. More than 700 local languages for 275 million speakers. Austronesian and Papuan language. No Papuan languages in the Philippines, I guess. So, but we don't have the map. But if we can keep the map in mind, we must underline the fact that among these 700 regional languages, approximately 300 of it are Papuan languages or languages spoken in Papua. And the linguistic diversity is much more important in the east side of the archipelago compared to the west side. Foreign languages, not that much. Dutch has completely disappeared. English still not very used, actually. Most of Indonesian people, they don't speak English. Including the students too, in the university, everything is taught in Indonesian, actually. This is completely different with what we can see in Malaysia, for instance, which is completely anglicized, and maybe in the Philippines, I don't know. But anyway, in Indonesia, very few people do speak English, although it's very appealing for the parents and for students to learn English. It gives them the possibility to have further studies in Australia or other countries. So it's beginning to be important, but not yet. And they do not have enough teachers who are able to teach English in the classrooms, in the secondary school system. So it's growing. And Chinese has completely disappeared. I don't know what's the case. It's in the Philippines too. In Thailand, where I'm living, many Chinese people, Thai people from China, they do speak Chinese. They understand, speak Hokkien, they speak Mandarin. In Malaysia, all Chinese people, they do speak Mandarin on a daily basis, although they are Malaysian. And, but in Indonesia, the Chinese was forbidden. The use of Chinese has been forbidden for 30 years, and the younger generation hasn't learned Chinese at home, neither at home nor at the university or anywhere else. We have a handful of major languages. Javanese first, secondly Sundanese. Sundanese is spoken in the western part of the island of Java. Minangkabau, which is spoken in the western part of Sumatra, and in many places they have a big diaspora in Indonesia. Bugis and Makassar, closely related languages in the southern part of Celebes of Sulawesi, Balinese, Batak, etc., etc., etc. Yeah. So, just 2 or 3 words about Malays. It is important, and it's becoming more and more important since the last decades, and in the future it will be much more important than today. For Malay, we have 2 standards, Malaysian and Indonesian. The standard spoken in Malaysia, sometimes it's called Malaysian, sometimes it's called Malay. I don't want to elaborate further on that topic, but it's a problem. For them, but it's a problem. It's a big problem. Anyway, there are 2 standards, Malay or Malaysian for Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei, and Indonesian. And you will find national substandards in those countries. Not in Singapore. Singapore, it's English. In Brunei, it's Bruneian, Melayu Brunei. In Malaysia, it's Melayu Klang. It's a Klang Valley, which is spoken around Kuala Lumpur. And in Indonesia, it's Jakartanese. And Jakartanese, it developed in Jakarta, hence the name Jakartanese, but it's understood, and in a way, and by the young generation, used not daily, but it's fully understood everywhere in Indonesia, everywhere. So it can be considered as a national substandard. But beside this, you will find local substandards, of course. Tens of dialects, and some of the dialects are genetic Malays, others are Creoles. Here's a map. You can see there are other dialects than what I've shown here on the map. CR designates the Creoles. And you will find Creoles in the eastern side, mainly in eastern Indonesia, but in the western side too, and as well as in Malaysia. Singapore has a Berber Malay too, and you will find Berber Malay with the Creole in Malacca here. Okay? So it's very rich. It's very rich. And why is it important? Because many people are not turning from regional languages to Indonesian, but to substandards, local, regional substandards, which are competing and really endangering the regional languages. The Indonesian has a very strong narrative, very, very strong narrative. It begins with the use of Malay, let's say Malay with quotation signs. What kind of Malay? There was, of course, in the former times, a huge diversity of Malays, but it was a very old lingua franca, since maybe the 11th, 12th century, maybe earlier. We have found a description in Old Malay have been found in Laguna, here in the Philippines. So Old Malay was spoken and used maybe by very few and tiny circles, but it was used too, maybe as a trade language here, until here in the Philippines. During the colonial era and from 1848 onwards, it was used practically as the second official language, besides Dutch. So it was important. But it's a minority language, spoken by a very tiny minority of speakers, but they spread all over the archipelago. Oops. And the Malay has been accepted by the young nationalists in Indonesia because it was a minority language, because Javanese would have been difficult to be accepted by other people than Javanese, very difficult. It has an image of an easy language, which is not the case, but it is considered, and it was considered as a language easy to acquire, to speak, which is the case, yes, for daily use. It's very easy, but if you want to go further and to write and to think and to create in Indonesian or in Malay, it's different. It's much more difficult. So they have this very strong narrative of the language, acknowledged and accepted and considered as the language of unity since 1928, and with the first linguistic congress held in Surakarta in Java in 1938. And this narrative still very alive until now. No one has never contested the position and the status of Indonesia. No one. Even autonomist or independentist movements in Aceh or in West Java in the 50s, in Aceh until the early 2000s, no one asked for the local languages to become the new national language of a new state they would have created in Aceh or in West Java. And even now in the Papua, no Papua language is really mastered by the world local population, and when they communicate abroad, they mainly use Indonesian and English. English has a special position in Papua. I return on it later. So it's really important, and it's completely different with what we can see in Malaysia. In Malaysia, they don't have such a strong narrative, strong and common narrative. Chinese, Indonesian, they speak Indonesian and they consider the Indonesian as their own language, which is not the case for Chinese in Malaysia, not at all. So, from the independence, the Declaration of Independence in 1945 until the late 20th century, during 50 years, what was the base of for the status and the use and the policies related to regional languages. First, Indonesia has just one national language, Indonesian, compared to, for instance, Singapore. They have one national language and 4 official languages: Malay, Tamil, Mandarin, and English. Yeah. English. So, but there is a recognition for regional languages, which is not in the Constitution, but this is written in the commentaries on the Constitution. So it's not a constitutional text, but it's the text you have to refer on when you speak about regional languages in regions where the local languages or local language or languages, are carefully cultivated by the people. Javanese, Indonesian, Madurese, they will be respected and cultivated by the state. They form a part of the living Indonesian culture. It's very interesting. Carefully cultivated. What happens if the language is not carefully cultivated or considered less carefully cultivated? What happens? First. Secondly, Javanese, Indonesian, Madurese. All these 3 languages have been heavily influenced by Javanese, spoken in the island of Java and the island of Sumatra, which is very close to Java. What about the other languages, the other islands? Nothing. They form a part of living Indonesian culture, nothing related to a major function of language, communication, representation of the world. It's just related to a culture, but not to each local culture. It's related and subordinated to the national culture. They are part of it. We have a wall with a lot of small parts, and these small parts have no independent life, actually. They must be considered as being possibly used by Indonesian or for Indonesian, but in no case they can be considered independently of the national language. So we see very clearly this position below the national, which is not surprising. It was a new country, and they enforced this policy at a time where, at the same time, the colonial were trying, it was war actually, colonial war, and the colonials were trying to make all these local regions, cultures, and languages split. And they tried to create artificial parts or countries inside Indonesia, all along the colonial era. Of course, Malay had a special position, but always the colonists stressed the fact that no other force than the colonial itself were able to put all these people together. And what Indonesian people had to demonstrate, that they had internally the forces needed to put all the people together. Hence the position of the language. And of course, an opposition between modernity represented by Indonesian and tradition represented by the local languages. But I guess maybe the same here. If we look at the relation between Filipino and the local languages, I don't know. But anyway, it's something very common. And in Europe too, we see local languages, regional languages as force of the past, and national language as the force for the future. In 1975, things changed a little bit. It was the time of the Suharto era, and they enforced the ideology of development. And from that time, they began to, the power and the government began to consider or to see the local languages as regional or local tool for communication, for local and regional identities, but as a resource for the enrichment of the national language. That's what I've seen in my PhD on development of terminologies in Indonesia. They tried, many times they tried to, instead of borrowing terms from English, to use terms or words taken from the local languages, which is not very convincing, because if you borrow a word from Javanese, Javanese will understand, Sundanese and Balinese will understand, of course, maybe, but people from very remote region in Sulawesi, it's a foreign word for them, and it's much more convenient for them to borrow from English instead of a regional language. So it's an ideological point of view and approach of the problem. Although the Indonesian has such a strong position, maybe because it has such a strong position, there was no ban on the local languages. They were used in the primary schools as a tool to teach Indonesian for three years, and then it was reduced to 2 years. So, and it's still really alive everywhere in the daily life or in the local landscapes, linguistic landscapes. Until now, it's possible to find local languages everywhere. So, but the importance of regional languages were much reduced in the secondary level, whereby it was taught, yes, but no one cares actually. It's not very important for the students, nor for the teachers. So it's not based on your marks in regional languages. Yeah, then you will be able to enter a prestigious university, of course. So it's not very important, and the substandards are completely ignored until now. So the people were thinking that, well, regional languages will disappear at what point, when, we don't know, and we don't really care. It will happen, just like that. I remember an article published in the 70s explaining that by 2047, 100% of the population aged 5 years and over would be able to speak Indonesian. This happened 10 years ago. It's already the case now. well, I would say roughly speaking, approximately speaking. So the movement has been much, much quicker than what was expected in the 1970s. This is to say that beside the policies, there is other forces, working forces, the interest, the will of the people, the need for careers, for social life, because they move from a region to another to learn and to use and to master the national language. So policies cannot make things change so fast. I don't think so. So then, and the Indonesian people began to be aware of that movement toward the very last years of the 1990s. 1997, 1998, 98. You begin to see articles in newspapers speaking about the attrition of the vanishing languages. And it began to be a problem for the people. If we see now the relation between different languages spoken in the country, this is what say the official discourse, what say the institution, what say the National Agency for Language, Pusat Bahasa in Jakarta. You have three sets of languages. First, above all, is Indonesian, the master, and then foreign languages who can enrich, but who can threaten the national language and infecting it with germs from outside, you know. And here, regional languages, which can enrich and protect the national language towards the danger from outside. What are the relation between regional languages and foreign languages? We don't know. It's not clear. And what must be kept in mind is when we speak about foreign languages, what we have in mind, what they have in mind, it's English only. Dutch is out of the gate completely. But what about Arabic? Arabic is an important language for 80% or more of the Indonesians who are Muslims. And they don't learn Arabic at school, but they learn to read Arabic, to be able to read the Quran. You know? So Arabic is everywhere in a way. Although in the mosque on Friday, the prayer is given in Indonesian or in local languages, not in Arabic. Anyway, Arabic doesn't appear anywhere in the official language. And not all regional languages are concerned here. One important thing is the substandards are not taught at all. We may give this representation, which is maybe a false one, because here you have Indonesian and the Malays. Here you have regional languages. But this put the standard above everything. Here below it, you have the Malays, local Malays, regional Malays as vernaculars or vehiculars, and the regional languages. Actually, this scale cannot be taken as at face value. It's not possible. This is what I propose. In urban context, you will have standard language above the others, regional language far below, because in multi-ethnic environment, people will shift to Indonesian quickly, or they will shift to the substandards even quicker. So you have these substandards, Malays or something else, which are really important and much more important than the standards for the daily interaction between the speakers. Of course, we don't speak in the standards daily. Well, depend on what your job, but usually people working in the streets, people working in shops, they do not interact in the standards, of course. So this could be the presentation of the relation of these three sets of languages in urban context. And in rural context, it would be slightly different. In rural context, regional languages are much more important, compared to local substandards, which are more spoken in urban areas compared to villages and compared to the countryside. So the position of the regional languages is better here. I would like to add something here. In some specific occasion, it can be inconceivable to speak in Indonesian. I take as an example of two young people who plan to marry, and you have the family of the groom coming to the house of the bride, the future bride, asking for organizing the event. Well, if they are all originating from the same region, how far could be possible for them to interact and to speak national languages? It would be an acknowledgement that I don't speak to you in Javanese or in Balinese because I'm not able to do so. So I have to shift to the national languages, which would not be really appreciated. So they have to use the local language, which in some specific occasion is much more valued than the national one. In other occasions, if you take someone from, let's say, from a Batak family, and for the groom and the bride, or conversely, from, let's say, from Madura or from another region, they have no common language other than Indonesian, and they will have to interact and to speak together in Indonesian. This happened too, of course. But if you are originating from the same region, you meet outside of your region someone who is originating from the same one. If you refuse to speak the regional language, it's a way of giving a distance, a sense of distance. I don't want to be too close to you. So it can be very difficult to be accepted. After the end of the Suharto era, many things happened. First one, a reduced stress on the standard. Clearly. So this is what's Bahasa Gaul? Bahasa Gaul, it's interact, to have relation with. And Bahasa Gaul, it's the name of the substandard used by the youth in Jakarta mainly. It's very popular. And here you have a teacher who began to teach Bahasa Gaul because it's a little bit more valued than previously. So this is important. Right now, if you have a smartphone, you want to use a new app, you can see the app or you can see the advertisement exclusively for some products, exclusively written in the substandards, completely, which was impossible, let's say 25 years ago, impossible. So it was strictly limited to formally the substandards were strictly limited to, well, lower social classes and for private interactions. So more place for the substandards and the regional languages on radio and TV too. As a consequence of the increasing place of the substandard, it's a decline of the diglossia, actually. Yeah. It's possible to use and to interact in just one of these two language variants of the diglossia. But actually, Indonesia, it's not a diglossic country. It's a pluriglossic country. And this increasing concern for the loss of regional languages, which have encouraged some people and institutions to try to help or to give more visibility or better functions to the regional languages. Attrition. Now, if we compare the use of the regional languages between 1990 and 2010, we don't have the figures for I don't have the figures for the last census, which was held in 2020, 2-3 years ago. But anyway, you can see an increase. It's twice for the daily use of Indonesian 33 years ago, and in 2010. This is problematic in a way. What's Indonesian? We don't know. Of course, when we speak about Indonesian, people may have very different ideas of the language in mind. For some of the people, it's a standard. For others, it's a substandard. And the people, the officers of the census in 2010, they had a very special way to be sure that the people they had to record were able to speak Indonesian. So the way they found to be sure that the people they want to record the answers was able to speak Indonesian, they just ask, "Bisa bahasa Indonesia? Do you speak Indonesian?" If the guy answers yes, okay, he speaks the language, which is in no way a proof. I can say yes, but what else? And nothing behind. And we can see a decreasing trend for other languages, not all. Sundanese still quite strong, you know. Madurese, but maybe they will bias in the figure here. But roughly speaking, all are lower. The figures are lower 20 years later, and more specifically for Javanese. I would say that although Javanese is the first original language spoken in Indonesia, spoken by 42% of the population, the decrease of the use of Javanese goes faster than to other regional languages. Maybe if I have time, I'll return on that point later. So the figure we have shown don't say everything, of course. We have to know that a lot of tens, hundreds of languages are really endangered in Indonesia and will disappear within 15, 20 or 25 years, maybe more than 300 languages. Because these languages are not transmitted anymore from a generation to the other, especially in urban contexts. And we know that the population in Indonesia is shifting from countryside to the cities now. Right now, a little bit more than 50% of the Indonesian population is living in towns, which was not the case 20 or 30 years ago. As for Javanese, I mentioned previously, it's interesting. It has been studied by a linguistic anthropologist in Jakarta, in the core of the Javanese culture. And what this colleague has shown is that in the younger generation, the boys and the girls do not have the same attitude toward the regional languages. The girls seem to be more attracted by Indonesian compared to the boys. And they shift quickly and more quickly. The girls, the mothers, more quickly compared to the boys and the fathers. Maybe because the language itself and the use of Javanese language give a better position to male compared to females. I think it's one of the reasons. And let's say 40 years ago, when a young Javanese, a guy or a woman, was thinking about getting married, one of the main question was ethnics. I want to marry a Javanese. I don't want to marry a Sundanese. I want to marry a Javanese. This was the case until the end of the 20th century. Now, what's important is I want to marry a Muslim or I want to marry a Christian. So the issue of ethnicity and language, which was so important formerly, now is in the background and has been replaced by the religious affiliation. And of course, well, if you think about religious affiliation, a young Javanese will marry with someone from everywhere in Indonesia. The choice is much larger compared to an ethnic. And for other ethnic groups, it's even less, the choice, even reduced. So those languages are not equally endangered, and especially what we have to underline is the position of local or regional vehiculars. We have regional vehiculars. in many regions in Indonesia. And these languages are stronger and more protected towards, for the decline compared to very local languages. The most endangered languages are these small dialects, small languages, which are spoken in the vicinity of big towns, whereby the small villages will be swallowed by the city, can be swallowed by the city in 5, 10, or 15 years. And the substandards, once again, which are very important. So things have changed in the minds, and even for the government, for the administration. First on the norms, the laws, the regulations, and then general norms. One important step could have been the law of 2009. I remember in 2004 or 2005, many times I met with people from the language agency in Jakarta. At that time I was very close to them, and they were thinking about the new law of the language, about the language. And they were preparing a new law. They came in Paris and in different countries to see what are the local regulations related to the language. Nothing interesting in France, be sure, nothing. And in the first draft, the very first draft of the law, there was this statement considering Indonesia's linguistic diversity as a gift of God, which is, well, it's a strong statement. If it's a gift of God, it's something sacred. You cannot disturb it. You have to preserve it. Of course, 5 years later, when the law was discussed in the parliament and finally voted and enforced, this has disappeared. And what could have been a specific law on language became a law on flag, language, and the symbols of the state. So we come back to the use of the languages as symbols, as representing identities, and subordinating the local language to the national language. No changes with the policy enforced since the mid-1970s. And the stress still Indonesian, of course. There are 2 decrees in 2014, traditional decrees, and in 2019, both stressing the ILA national languages, but with being more open towards the local languages. Local press was accepted in local languages, which was not the case previously. 20 years ago, it was forbidden. You have a radio station, local radio station, speaking to local people. It was forbidden to use the local language, which is not the case anymore now. Teaching in transmigration region, this is important. Your parents are coming from Java. They have transmigrated in Sulawesi. Why should you have to learn the local language instead the language of your parents? Why? It wasn't possible, now it's possible. And other changes, but the position of the government is a little bit more flexible as it was before, but there is no binding provision. So you have constraints related to Indonesian, but related to regional languages, you are free to do whatever you want, actually. So no big changes. And there was a law in discussion, or not in discussion, but a project for the law, Rancangan Undang-Undang on regional languages, which has been discussed in the ministries for years. And apparently, well, now it has been completely abandoned. But luckily, you find people who ask for such a law, especially in Bali, in December 2022. This is interesting. I'll return on it later. And you have specific norms related to the schools and the media. I think no need to elaborate much more on this. I explained already that for education, the use of local languages was authorized in the first and second level of the primary school, and it's taught for years until the end of the secondary school, but with as a really a secondary topic, and with two dangers related to regional languages. The first one was 20 years ago, the idea of Anglicizing the school system, and this was maybe it's a good idea seen from outside, but seen from inside it's a good idea. It seems to be a good idea, but the consequences would have been huge actually. Of course, all schools would have preferred to teach English and to expel the local language. So it would have been enforced at the expenses of local languages for sure. And the teachers of local languages, they protest, of course, they protest. And finally, the Supreme Court gave a decision who forbid this so-called international school, which means English school, actually, not because of their interest for the regional languages, but because it could have challenged the national language. Radio and television, there is a law 20 years ago. The law is completely closed to the use of regional languages on radio station and TV, but no one respects it. So nobody cares. It's just a law, an empty law. Luckily, it's much more interesting. What we've seen since the early 2000s, the first step, important, was the decentralization law of 2002. Actually, the very first move towards decentralization, it began at the end of the 1990s, during the Suharto era. It began at that time. But the rule of the game really changed after 2002. And after that, we've seen for 10 years and more local regulation related to regional language everywhere in Indonesia, more specifically in Java, but not only in Java. The first one was in 2003 in the province of West Java, and they stated that Sundanese, Cirebonese, and Bekasi Malay are established as co-official languages of this province, which is completely crazy, I would say. What does it mean? It was purely political, purely symbolic, but anyway, it is important too. You see this name of the language. What's Cirebonese? Cirebonese is a dialect of Javanese. It's Javanese, basically, a dialect of. What's Bekasi Malay? It's a dialect of Malay. Sundanese is another language spoken in the countryside and in the mountains. So it's interesting because on one side people can say that it's a nonsense, it has no consequences, but in another side it's huge to give such an importance, even on the local level, to give such an importance and to recognition to the local languages. So that's what I say, it's huge and it's nothing at the same time. Should I? 5 minutes, okay. I finished with the decentralization policy, okay. So, and what we've seen in other provinces was the same. Very often, the use of local languages was coordinated with the way of local dress, and the compulsory use of the language and the dress 1 day a week in the administration. It's interesting. I shift this. So this provision related to local languages and the use is not very clear. So what happened if, let's say, in Java, Central Java, once a week you have to speak Javanese in the offices and someone doesn't speak Javanese? What happened? The answer that, okay, we are open to anyone. You can't speak Javanese, just try to speak it and it will be okay. But another problem was okay, you speak Japanese, I speak Japanese, but I don't speak the standard. Or I speak, you know, in Japanese you have levels, language level related to, well, you speak to someone who's higher than you or someone who's lower. If I don't master the levels, what happens? The answer is, okay, okay, do your best, it will be okay. So the attitude of the authorities was very open, but it doesn't really answer other questions, like if we decide to give a special status, even once a week, only a special status to a local language, what happened with the standard? We have to decide to design and to decide what will be the standard for the local language, and it's the same in the school. If you want to teach a local language or to teach in the local language, at one point you will have to decide what will be the standard used in schools, and very often it's very difficult to take a decision on it. The last point was efforts made by the local governments in schools with what they called local contents, muatan local. This happened before the 2000s. The problem is when you teach as local content, let's say Japanese or another language, what do you teach actually? Do you teach the people to speak the language? Usually not. Usually you teach people to read the Japanese script, which is completely unused anymore now. Or you teach the people to respect the levels of the language, which is very difficult and very boring. Why should I learn to speak to the Sultan? If I meet with the Sultan, I can master the Japanese I should use in the palace. I shift to Indonesian, over, of course. So these lessons were not very important, and many schools decide not to teach local languages as local content, but English or computer, which is much more awaited by the families compared to local languages. So I have many more to say, but I can stop here. If I have time, I would like to show you a few photos related to the use of local languages in the public space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jérôme, for giving us a glimpse of the language situation in Indonesia, the regional languages, national language, and the problems encountered by these languages. I think we all can relate to the experience of Indonesia here in the Philippines, right? So at this point, we're now opening the floor for their questions. Yes, I see a hand there. Yeah. Sure.
So I'm curious if what institutions in Indonesia or organizations are the center of decentralization of language policy and the recognition of local languages, because from what I remember, there is no one university that's the center of this institution.
Yes, it's the institutionally speaking, it's outside the universities. So there was at first it was linked to the university, but linked to the ministry too, and finally things changed after the beginning of the Suharto era, the late 60s, early 70s. Since the 1975 until now, you have this national agency which is called Pusat Bahasa, the Center for Language, and which has a national policy, which who can design new laws. So for instance, the law of 2009 I spoke about was designed and proposed by this Pusat Bahasa to the ministry, to the parliament. And they have, in each province, they have representation. So they have what they call Balai Bahasa, the house of language, in each region. And they do not have really the same tasks. So the task in the region is mainly to make researches, to protect, to dynamize local languages and literature. Local literature it's an important matter in Indonesia. Literature in local languages, I mean. But whatever which has to be decided at the national level is decided in Jakarta and planned to. And now, the issues related to regional language is not very important. Something much more important now and for the future, since maybe 15 years ago, is the teaching of Indonesian for foreigners. It's much more appealing for them, because if you try to develop the didactics and pedagogy of Indonesian for foreigners, you can attract foreigners who will come in the country to learn the language. It's more interesting for them and for the universities too. But in many universities, you have a department of Javanese in Universitas Indonesia in Jakarta. But it depends on the language. If you have a language as written in the Constitution, in the commentary of the Constitution, carefully, protected by the population, or to say it differently, the languages which have a written literature, they will have, for sure, a department of that language, Javanese, Sundanese, Batak, or whatever, Balinese, in a local university, public university, for sure, there will be. But for the other languages, well, there's a little hope.
Okay, thank you. What's your name again?
Rohan.
Thank you, Rohan. Okay, so yes, we have Steve.
Comparing with the development of Filipino as the national language of the Philippines, Indonesia really did a successful job in convincing everyone that Indonesian should be accepted. So what exactly did Suharto do to convince the people to adapt?
It was done before. It was much earlier. It was done. I think that I would say that there was 3 steps. The first one was in the late 20s and during the 30s, between this Congress, which decided the Indonesian to be the national language of the future country. What's interesting at that time, what was behind Indonesian was completely unclear. There was no definition of Indonesian. Bahasa Indonesia, this means Indonesian language, but it means the language of Indonesians, you know? And just the language of the people. Any language can be the language of the people. So they didn't want to define it, and it was much better not to define it too early, because there was a stress between the Malay used by Chinese, which was very strong, with a very rich literature and press on one side. Other side was the standard defined by the colonials, quite strong too. They didn't want to choose between both. Finally, they chose not for the Melayu Cina, no, they chose for the colonial standard. They changed it a little bit. A little bit mixed with some Javanese, some Jakartanese too. The second step was during the Japanese era, 3 years. Because the Japanese entered the Dutch Indies in March 1942. And within few weeks, the use of Dutch was forbidden, completely forbidden, already, even for court. You could call someone forbidden. The use of Chinese was impossible. The Chinese were the enemies of the Japanese, you know. So all schools had to, not all the people were enrolled in school, of course, but the schools and all administration, they had to shift within a few weeks from Dutch to Malay, to Indonesian. The Japanese were not interested in local languages. They had translators from Malay to Japanese, but no Japanese were able to speak and to understand the local languages. They were not interested in Javanese, Sundanese, or whatever. So, and this happened very quickly. And we have the testimony of a Dutch guy who went back to Indonesia in 45. That guy was, he was a priest, working in Jakarta, strong Javanese culture and language country. He left in 42, came back in 45, and he was really surprised. Everywhere in the street, people don't speak Javanese anymore. They speak Indonesian. They broken Indonesian, of course, mixed with Javanese. But this make things changing quicker and quicker. And well, the language was very, very attractive. And we must keep in mind that the Sukarno era was not an era of disorder as it has been taught by Suharto and the generals, not at all. And the first steps of the alphabetization and Indonesianization of the population, this began during the late 1940s and the 1950s. They did a lot, actually. Within 20 years, they did a lot, you know. So it was an important moment, and the policies enforced by Suharto was based on what had been done before. It's if I look to the journals used or read by the Indonesian teachers in the late 40s and the early 50s, that's what I did for my PhD. And they had a special journal entitled Pembina Bahasa Indonesia, the developer or the builder of Indonesian. And there was advices to the teachers Indonesian and things like that, and even ideas for the exams, things like that. And you had the question of the readers who are teachers of Indonesian, and they ask to the journal, is it right? Can I speak in that way? Can I use this word? And they were not sure, because they were Sundanese, they were Buginese, they were whatever, and they had to teach a foreign language for them. National language, but not their own language. But they accepted it.
Well, actually hearing that, it would have been a good idea to duplicate the regional experience or approach. We're in the Philippines, but of course the Philippines has a different context, experience, like the colonial language, English is deeply ingrained in our system, in the educational system. So yeah, I think it's possible to do that here. Yes, maybe we can call another, yeah.
Yes, hello. So my question was, is until now in the really lower education, are regional languages still used as mediums of communication with young children in, I guess, in rural areas, or is Indonesian fully imposed onto the lower levels of education?
Your lower level, you mean for the primary education, and the first levels, the first years of the primary education. By the law, it's possible, by the law. But what is the reality beyond? It's not very clear. I've never made any field researchers to know what is used and what is done by the teachers. I think that it's completely different in monolingual and multilingual regions. If you in the cities, it's much more difficult. I guess that in many cities there is no teaching with or on the regional languages. In the countryside, it can be very difficult. In some countries, in some provinces, all people are completely mixed everywhere, even in the countryside, even in the villages. So it can be difficult. That's the first point. Second one is the skills of the teacher himself. It's a severe limitation to ask for the teacher to be able to teach in the local language. This means that if you're originating from Sulawesi, you are a Buginese speaker, can you be forbidden to teach as a teacher in the primary level, let's say in Sumatra or somewhere else in Kalimantan? Of course not. Of course not. So it's a really severe limitation to the mobility of the teachers. I'm not sure it's a good thing. But anyway, many people want to teach in the place they grow, and it's okay for them, of course. But it's difficult to to make it compulsory for all the teachers. The third problem, which is well known here, I'm sure, is the material you can use. So if you want to write and to edit and to publish material for the teaching of Javanese, well, it's quite easy because they have a very long tradition of it since the mid-19th centuries, and a bigger tradition for literature, it's okay. Balinese is okay too. Buginese, well, it's okay, no problem. Malay too. But in Iban or in Bidayu or in Bidayu is not spoken in Indonesia, I'm sorry. But in any dialect languages, well, you have to decide what will be the standard for a given region, what will be the borders of this region. Do you have to take into account the administrative borders? Okay, based on the idea that on this side of the border you have such and such and such ethnic group, and the other side different groups, which is not the case actually. It's really difficult. I think that the best way is, but I'm pretty sure that it's what is done, because now actually the authority above the primary school, it's administratively speaking, it's a level 2, not the province, but district. And the district, well, it depends of in Java districts are very small. In the Papua, very big. It depends, it's based on the population and the development of administration there. So, beside the decision which can be taken by the head of the executive in the district, which Indonesian call the Bupati, I'm sure that many decisions are taken by the head of the school himself or herself, and by the teacher themselves. I remember about maybe 10 years ago, I met with a school teacher in Bali. He was teaching very young children, the first level of the primary school. And I asked him, what language do you use? And do you have sometimes children who do not speak who do not understand Indonesian? Because my assumption was, with media in Indonesian, in standard and substandard, everywhere, video games, social media, everywhere, TV, mainly TV for children who cannot read, in Indonesia everywhere, they must have some Indonesian, especially if the parents want to speak sometime in Indonesian with maybe not with the children, but with the neighbors or anyone else. And I was really surprised. He told me, no, this is not the case. He has, it's not the majority, but he has always to teach to young pupils who cannot speak Indonesian. They don't like to watch TV. They prefer to play lion in the, what do you call this? Lion. Kite. They want to play kite in the villages or in the rice fields. They don't want to watch TV. They don't want to play video games. So, and Bali is not a remote place. It's a very touristic place with a lot of foreigners traveling around. So this can happen. But and he has to adapt and to decide. You have in front of you, let's say, 10 people who can fluently speak Indonesian, 15 who half, and 5 of 10 who don't understand a single word.
Just a quick question. So in areas where languages or local languages are taught in schools, so is it limited to the primary years from grades 1 to 3, or is it extended to grades 4?
Formally it was 3 years. At first it was 3 years, and this was a very old regulation from the colonial times, actually, from the late colonial times. And since the early 2000s, I don't remember exactly when, but for sure since 2014, it's limited to 2 years only. 2 years only. But what does it mean? I'm sure that part of the teaching is completely given in Indonesian and other teaching given in the regional languages. Take another example, again related to Bali. Let's say that in the villages and most of the cities, 80%, maybe 85 or 90% of the people are Balinese and they are Hindu. If you want to teach, they teach religion at school. I'm pretty sure that they teach in Balinese, not in Indonesian. And when you go to the temples there are no pronouns like in churches or in mosques, but a lot of indication are given to the people coming here to pray and to bring offerings, always in Balinese, and always in High Balinese. So you need to, not to speak, but to understand High Balinese. So I'm sure they learned it partly in specific courses on language until the secondary school, and partly in the courses on religion, I'm sure.
Somehow it's similar to the Philippines, where children are taught on the first grade, kinder, up to the third grade, and then Filipino and English.
Yeah, but what we see now, especially in the cities and in private primary schools and private kindergarten, it's what want the parents? They don't want regional language, they want English.
Okay. All right, so it's 11:31. Okay, so maybe we can entertain one more question from Professor Petas.
Thank you very much. I'm just curious on the intellectualization of the Indonesian and other regional languages. Like, how do they decide on the foreign concepts coming in contact with their language? Like, do they adapt it, example from English without changes, or do they use their regional or local languages, or they invent words?
Yeah, this is not an important matter for regional languages, but it is for Indonesian. So, I would say, but maybe I won't answer your question precisely, but I would say that the foreign concepts, ideas, and terms enter to Indonesian first, and they are mediated by Indonesian to come to local languages. And there is a lot of cut shifting and borrowing by local languages to Indonesian. A lot of it. So this is a problem, that there is no enrichment anymore of regional languages. So in this way, the languages are there. They do not evolve anymore, and if they evolve, it's not very exciting. It's by a change of the language system of itself. So the morphosyntaxics will be influenced by Indonesian. Once again, an example from Balinese. Balinese have a system counting system, which is very complex. You have one word for 200, another word for 300, another for 400. So it's changed. It's no fixed rule. You have to learn all of it by heart. And now the people, they still use the numerals taken from the language, from Balinese, but the arrangement and the combination of the numerals follows the Indonesian rule, not the local one.
All right, so thank you, Jérôme, for addressing the questions. And I hope this is a good way to promote Bahasa Indonesia Malaysia. So for those who are interested, taking the course.
Yes.
Yeah, Sir Jem and I are taking the course, and plan B as well. Okay, so unfortunately we don't have enough time. So I know some of you are still interested, no? To continue the conversation, the discussion, but perhaps you can contact Sir Jérôme through his email. And at this point, before we end the event, I'd like to call Dr. Maria Cristina Gallego to present a certificate and token of appreciation.
I'll just read the certificate of appreciation given to Jérôme Samuel for delivering a lecture titled Language Attrition and Language Display, Regional Languages Policies in Indonesia Today, as part of the Linguistics Special Lecture Series organized by the UT Department. Thank you, Jérôme.
Thank you.
Very simple person.